Tell me about Better. Well, you said it was
Sure.
a good program.
You want me to start at the beginning?
Well, tell me why it's a good program.
Yeah. Well, it's a good program because it's a direct. Figure out how to phrase this. I don't consider it a tax incentive or a tax break. I consider it the correction of an error that we should have never been doing. We should not have been taxing machinery and equipment, because that's a direct tax on the means of manufacturing, which is what you want to have in your state. There's an old rule: if you want to have something, you provide incentives, and if you don't want to have it, you tax it. And we want investment in Maine, and particularly we want investment in manufacturing. So that was the whole theory. Let me give you a little history. This idea first came to me in 1993 when I was running for governor from Buzz Fitzgerald, who was one of my oldest friends and was the president of Bath Iron Works. And we were talking about tax policy, and he said, Angus, it's crazy. If we put in a new piece of equipment at Bath Iron Works, we have to pay the property tax on it every year, whether we're making any money or not. It discourages us from making investments. And of course, he had to work with the parent company somewhere else, and he said it made it harder for us to justify capital investments. And so in my campaign in 1994, it was one of the proposals that I made for improving Maine's business climate. It was, I think, among the first initiatives in my first year in office, in the first several months. But when we can talk about how it was implemented and why it was set up the way it was and all those kinds of things. But the bottom line is, we want people investing in productive equipment in Maine in order to sustain and grow the economy, and we had a very big disincentive to that, which we essentially eliminated.
You say on the website that nullify the property tax and equipment through the business equipment reimbursement program, which led directly to over $1 billion of new capital investment in Maine. Where does the number $1 billion come from?
Well, the first one is really easy. It's $500 million, which is what the national semiconductor investment was, and I think that's maybe close to $1 billion by this time. But at the time, the original investment was about $500 million, and we know because they told us that this particular provision was absolutely essential to their decision to build that project in Maine. They were looking at several other sites around the country and around the world, and it was the business equipment reimbursement that tipped the balance in Maine's favor. I mean, and they've said that. I mean, on the record, Paul Edmonds, who was the manager of the plant, has said that, and Brian Holla, who was the president of National Semiconductor, has said that. It was a big deal. So there's that one. And then as far as the other $500 million, there were a significant number of additional investments in the paper industry over the following couple of years, where this made a real difference. So I think that's a conservative figure, frankly, and I don't know. I don't have the exact figures now, but I think it's in the thousands of Maine businesses that have benefited from this program.
Yeah, there's about 1,800 a year, I believe, but
yeah.
Some come and go, but that's what I believe.
Right.
The Maine Revenue Service does not classify. They're the ones who really care for this program, take care of this
right.
program. They classify it as revenue foregone, not as an investment, because as they measure it every year, where the state is writing checks to
Sure.
the reimbursements, and those checks to date are $915 million has been spent on better reimbursements, and it's revenue foregone in their estimation, which means it's revenue that other taxpayers need to make up.
Yeah, well, basically, as I said at the beginning, I consider it a correction of a mistake in the tax system from the beginning. We never should have been taxing this kind of equipment, because it's a direct tax on manufacturing, and all of the economic data is that manufacturing jobs are the best you can have in terms of spin-off jobs elsewhere in the economy. And another factor that was influential to me when I was considering this proposal was that I remember learning in the campaign in 1993-94 that Maine was the second largest state in the country in terms of paper production, but we were something like 10th in terms of investment. And that's a recipe for decline. in a capital-intensive, technology-intensive industry like paper, if you're not investing, your company is slowly going to be going away. And that's why I don't. We could talk sort of philosophical. Is it an economic development project or is it a tax project? It's a tax change that's designed to comport with the realities of trying to encourage manufacturing in your state, or trying to even I would say not discourage it, because the tax program we had before actually discouraged it.
You mentioned this in your campaign under the headline jobs.
Yeah.
But when a company invests millions of dollars in new equipment, they're generally hoping to increase productivity. That's another way of saying hoping to have lower labor costs. So isn't it likely, at least in the short term, that this program reduces jobs, not increases jobs?
Depends entirely, and you got to look at a broader question. Number one, with National Semiconductor, it was a net increase, 500 jobs for the past 15 years, average salary $50,000. I don't know what the math comes out on that, but it's about $1/3 billion in that one plant alone in terms of the jobs, new jobs created. On the other hand, upgrading your equipment may in fact reduce employment in the immediate situation, but it keeps the plant there. So that's why I don't think you can apply, how many new jobs did it create, because it may have cost you 20, but it prevented the loss of 300. And again, in an industry like paper, when you're not investing, you're going out of business, and so that's why I don't think it can be judged simply on how many new jobs did it create, but how many jobs did it preserve in businesses that otherwise would have just gone somewhere else or not invested at all and gradually just faded away.
In 2006, the state's OPEGA office did a study of most of the economic development programs in the state, and they rated better quite poorly as a high risk because it has so few controls and studies and measurements on what it does. For example, on the question of performance measures, does it have adequate performance measures that allow the program, that could allow the program to be mismanaged or fail to meet its outcomes? There's a lack of independent review that may allow mismanagement or fraud to go undetected. Basically, the sum total of their study was that this program has no measurements, no proofs, no audits that this is money well spent.
I don't think you need a study to determine that not taxing manufacturing equipment is good public policy. Again, I just think that's common sense. We want people investing in Maine, so why should we tax at a high rate those investments? Because I don't need an economist to tell me that's going to discourage investment. And again, this was a common. I consider this basically a tax reform provision. It was getting rid of a tax we shouldn't have been collecting in the first place. Now, the result of that is an incentive to investment, and we know that the investment took place at National Semiconductor. Tam Brands up in Auburn made a public announcement that this was a crucial part of their decision to expand their plant. They otherwise were talking about moving to New Hampshire. Right. So, we have those kinds of expressed, but it's common sense that if you get rid of a disincentive to invest, you're going to get more investment, and ultimately more investment leads to more jobs, or at least the preservation of the jobs that we have. Tam Brands now probably employs 3 or 4 times the number of people that they employed when I remember the plant when the plant first came to my attention back in about 96 or 7. I don't know the exact number, but I think they're a significantly larger operation. Same thing with Pratt Whitney down in Berwick. I'm not sure what the employment status at GE in Bangor is, but again, I think the numbers are there.
Leonard DeLogue and others have made that why should we be assisting Fortune 500 companies in making investments when they can very well make them themselves? General Dynamics, GE, Procter & Gamble, these are huge
We're
national
not
corporations.
assisting them in making them investments. All we're saying is we're not going to hammer you if you're due.
But we're
That's an
hammering
important
them.
distinction.
Right.
Because what my contention is, we should have never been levying this tax in the first place. And so we're getting rid of something that was a major disincentive for people to invest. It's not an incentive, it's getting rid of a disincentive. I realize that's somewhat semantic, but I think it's an important point.
Do you have any evidence that before you got rid of this tax, that things were not being done? I think you mentioned the National Semiconductor. Was it your instinct from talking to people, their common sense, or was there some sort of more empirical look to decide this is worth doing?
It was common sense. National Semiconductor, we didn't even know about National Semiconductor at the time this was passed. That came out in the late summer of '95. And it happened that we had done the right thing. We didn't realize how right it was in terms of that particular major project. But it was based upon a common sense understanding that taxing manufacturing equipment was a disincentive to manufacturing. And everybody's talking about, we want manufacturing, we want those jobs. They have a tremendous effect on the economy. And so why should we be hitting people over the head if they want to make those kinds of investments?
Did you consider in any way limiting the program? I think eventually you did limit the program somewhat. I mean, it's almost any piece of equipment, at least in the beginning.
At the beginning, it was too broad, and we realized that. And it was a year or two later that we narrowed it. That we didn't want to be providing incentives for things that people would be buying anyway, lights, fixtures, and wiring in the building, and those kinds of things. We tried to narrow it. The original intent was manufacturing equipment. I mean, that was the idea, and also, of course, as you know, it was phased in. It didn't start whole hog. It would have been a $110 million program if we'd gone for every possible piece of equipment that was already in place. The other reason, and there was some controversy about it, but we said, okay, this only applies to new equipment after April 1st, 1995. People said, well, what about my equipment? I already did that. And my answer to that was, well, you made that decision without this law. So that's history, and also it was a practical way of dealing with the cost and the impact on the state. And of course, one of the complications here is this is a local property tax.
Right.
And we're talking about a state program. And under the Constitution, and also, frankly, politically, you can't do something on the state level that's going to suck $100 million out of all the communities without reimbursement. And there was some history here, which I was familiar with, where the state back in, the 70s, abolished the inventory tax, which was a local property tax on inventory. And they promised the towns they would reimburse them, and after a while they didn't. And the towns were pretty sensitive on this point when we made this proposal in 1995. So that was why our proposal was 100% reimbursement. This isn't going to cost the towns any money.
Do you think what do you think of the change that's been made afterwards under Governor Baldacci, where Better is mostly phased out and replaced by something called BETE, or BETE, same concept, but they don't have to apply for reimbursement now. This tax has just simply been eliminated.
And I think that if we could have done that in 1995, I think that would have been a preferable solution. But the problem was they've also significantly diminished the reimbursement to the communities. And we chose to go with 100% reimbursement. And
But it gets down to 50% at some point.
that's right.
Yeah.
And we had a constitutional problem. You can't just eliminate a tax that's on the that's a property tax and tell the towns tough break. There's got to be some reimbursement and part of this process is to being practical. And in order to pass muster with the communities, we committed to 100% reimbursement, which we maintained throughout my administration.
So even though this is a fairly high-cost program, $50 to $60 million a year, you think it's more than worth it?
Absolutely. And I vividly remember the press conference when it passed. And a reporter asked me, said, Governor, the projections of this for, fairly modest going up. What if it turns into be a much bigger number? And my response was, great, because that means we've had a huge increase in investment. That means it's working. and you know, it's sort of like they once asked me, well, you know, we make money on the tobacco tax. What if people stop smoking? My response to that was that'd be a good thing, even though we'd lose revenue. But in this case, absolutely. I mean, it has helped Maine to maintain itself, and in some cases grow significantly vis-a-vis our neighbors around the country. One thing I came to realize very early on is that the competition for jobs is fierce between states, but also between the U.S. and other countries. People have choices about where they put their capital. I'll never forget a business sending me a copy of a letter that he'd gotten from John Engler, the governor of Michigan. And it basically said, move your company to a certain part of Michigan and you will pay no taxes for 10 years. Mm-hmm. No property taxes, your employees won't pay sales taxes, won't pay income taxes. I mean, it was pretty breathtaking. And that was the kind of competition that we were up against. And I just consider this a common sense tax reform.
Is there any way that what you learned from Better applies to what you have to deal with here in the U.S. Senate?
Well, I think I don't know. I have never thought about that question. I think my first thought is that you should try to first apply a sort of common sense analysis to some of these things, and then do your more in-depth analysis. But the other thing I think I would learn from it is that it was this whole program was a product of compromise. We had to compromise with the municipalities to make it a reimbursement program rather than an abolishment of the tax where we would pay. You'll notice we paid the businesses.
Right.
That's because the municipalities didn't trust us.
Right.
And so the compromise was how it was structured, and that it would be phased in rather than cover every piece of equipment already in Maine. That was a compromise. That it would not cover certain, and there were some fights about what kind of machinery does it cover. I think what I take from that in terms of the U.S. Senate is that good policy is a result of the thinking of a lot of people, and people working together in good faith and compromising and coming up with a solution that's practical and works. And in fact, I'm not going to make a long speech about why I'm running, but I think that's one of the problems in Washington right now is that you've got people who think they have 100% corner on the truth and no compromise, and that's a recipe for no action.
And you said that before Bill Clinton, right?
I did. I loved it when Clinton said that. Yeah, that's the cornerstone and one of the cornerstones of my campaign. But this is it started with an idea. And we worked with the revenue people, we talked to the municipalities, we talked to the business community, and we felt, and we did a lot of talking to the Appropriations Committee. In fact, the Appropriations Committee, this was very unusual, invited me down to sit in their meeting when they voted it through.
Oh. Who was the chairman of you?
George Kerr.
George,
and I came down the hall, and very unusual for a governor to sit in a committee meeting, and I sat in on the meeting, and they voted the program through because they knew how hard we had worked for it, and they knew that it was something that I thought was important.
When I looked at some of the stories in the back, then I noticed that one of your unofficial supporters, Shelley Pingree, was somewhat critical of the program at the time, because it wasn't connected directly to jobs.
That's right. Well, and that's a good point. People talk about Shelley and I being friends. We were we had a lot of differences when she was in the legislature and I was governor. The point I've made in the campaign is you can be friends with people and still have political differences with them. But she was critical of the program all the way through. And one of the problems with the program was that because it was an appropriation. Mm-hmm. Two problems. One is it shows up on the books as spending. Right. So when you see King as a big spender, part of it was funding this tax reduction. So that was a problem that I'm wrestling with here 15 years later. But the second problem was that it did make it subject to the appropriations process, and it created uncertainty in the business community, which to some extent vitiated the benefit of it. When I'd go and talk to businesses and say, well, we've got this great program, they say, yeah, but you got to fight for it every year. Can we really count on it for 10 years? And that was a fair criticism, but again, politics is the art of the possible. And we designed and implemented the best program that we could, given the various interests that were involved, and it worked.
Is there anything I didn't ask you about regarding this? I should have.
No, I think you've covered it. I mean, I remember going through all of those fights back and forth, and of course I know Orlando well. But people used to say, "Oh, this is corporate welfare," and I said, "No, it isn't. This is an elimination of a tax we never should have been levying in the first place." And I just think it just makes common sense from the point of view of tax policy, and as a result, it's helped to maintain and stimulate the Maine economy.
Thank you very much, Governor. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good.